Okay, I can feel the excitement in the room. So, very warm welcome to all of you to this session where we will try to unpack the results of the US election on foreign policy, and we are going to try and have a double look. We're going to look at what we think, because we are still in the space of speculating, but we're going to try to anticipate what the US presidential election would mean for the US foreign policy vis-à-vis different regions and vis-à-vis different foreign policy issues, topics. So in order to do that, I have the great pleasure of having fantastic lineup of participants. Let me introduce them briefly to you. Let me start with Ursula Plassnik, who's very well known in this house since she was a professor in PSIA, but more importantly, she's a former foreign minister of Austria. And she is behind the European version of foreign policy. It's called European Voices, the last cover of which speaks of MEGA, Make Europe Great Again. So you may be interested in having a look. Next to her is Donald Kaberuka, former finance minister of Rwanda, former president of the African Development Bank. Donald will give us a sense of what to expect from the US foreign policy vis-à-vis macroeconomics. He's an expert on that, and also Africa. To my right, João Cravinho, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and also former Minister of Defense from Portugal, soon also to be professor with PSIA. Welcome. Connected online are also two great panelists. Han-koo, he's a former trade minister of Korea, now with the Peterson Institute, and he is going to help us understand what the US election could look like for Asia and also for international trade. We know that international trade is an area where we kind of have a bit of a better sense of what a Trump administration could look like. And last but not least, we have Maria Fernanda Espinosa. She is the former foreign minister of Ecuador, former president of the UN General Assembly, and she is going to try and help us understand what a Trump administration could mean for Latin America and for multilateralism. So you can see that this is across geographies, is also across topics. I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to dwell on zoom in on a particular topic. After we've done that, we will engage in a conversation with you. There are, as usual, two mics, one on each side of the room for you to line up and put your questions to the panelists. So, without further ado, let me start with you, Ursula. We are in Paris. Paris is in France, and France is in Europe. What is Europe to expect from a second Trump administration as regards foreign policy?
Well, thank you very much, Arancha. What do we have to expect? Do we have to expect the same thing all over again? Because we had 4 years of Trump already. Does it mean that this is going to be another prolongation? Most of us tend to think no. First of all, the world has changed. There are conflicts that have erupted and that need management. And Donald Trump has become more assertive, probably more unpredictable, more radical, and less constrained. So this is what we have to expect as Europeans. The basic assumption that I want to share with you is really that the European business model or model of governance is directly challenged both in style and to a certain extent in content when you look at the next president of the United States of America. Look at his style, self-proclaimed style of deal-making, and we will, I think, come back to that. There is, of course, this is what business people do. They make deals. Now, is the European Union an entity, a political entity that can deal well with deal-making? Question. There's quite a bit of deal-making backstage and even sometimes up front in the European Union. I just give you a recent example. To launch the beginning of the accession talks with Ukraine, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, obviously did a deal. Was it right? Was it not right? Was it good? Was it the right kind of deal? It's not so easy to keep 25 together. It's very much like driving a car with 27 wheels, 27 members, foreign policy being in particular sort of domaine réservé for these 27 countries, some of them big, all of them with their specific interests. Specific interests meaning also that they have different types of wisdom and knowledge and interests regionally, because all of us have different types of neighbors. So it's very difficult to forge a common strategy on any kind of matter, in particular on foreign affairs. And what do I mean when I say the European business model? It's the constant search of compromise. It's constant negotiation. It's night after night after night on level after level after level of trying to find a minimum or, if possible, a maximum amount of joint capacity to act. And this has to be done every single day. This is what makes, for me, the European Union so fantastic, because it's a learning organization. And it learns from its own experience of dealing with difficulties. Now, this is a particularly challenging time because we have so many different types of conflicts and types of challenges that we have to face at the same time. And I don't want to start talking about foreign affairs without coming to the basics of the European Union. We are lagging behind economically. We are not doing well. We are losing ground on the competitive edge compared to the United States and compared to China. Now, of course, this is a very generalized statement, but it's something that we should bear in mind. We wanted to be, in 2000, we had a plan, a big plan, to be the most competitive, knowledge-based economy in the world. Did we manage to put that into practice? Did we implement? Not so much, we have to admit. So, before starting to talk about foreign policy, we have to have a quick look at the economic basics. And this is where one of the big tasks are ahead for the European Union. And it doesn't really make a difference whether it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, in a way, because this type of homework has to be done. The European Union has to become much more competitive on so many issues in so many areas. And we have to do that quickly. That's number one. Because if we cannot provide the prosperity to the people, to the citizens of Europe, we don't even have to think about foreign policy. So we have to draw closer to our own citizens, to understanding what they want, how far they want to go, how far they can go, because it's not only happening in a faraway country, the United States of America, but it's happening in our own society. So we have to better understand how to deal with competitiveness and what to do about it. We have the good luck of having personnel in the European Union, which means we have a leading figure, Ursula von der Leyen. Everybody always calls for leadership. But then when you have it, you're not so happy, or not. Some people are not so happy about it. I'm very happy with the leadership of Ursula von der Leyen. She declared, when she started her first term in office, she declared she wanted a geopolitical commission. Some of us were sort of secretly shaking our heads and thinking, well, isn't that a bit preposterous? turned out that it is a dire necessity. It turns out that it is difficult to turn the European Union into a geopolitical actor. So we have to restore our competitiveness. We know we have the personnel to do that. We have the Commission members, and we even have the suggestions how to do it in practice. We have two rather substantive reports done by Enrico Letta and by Mario Draghi, and they go into the same direction of what needs to be done. So there's no excuse that we don't know. It's just the matter of mastering political will to do it. And the second thing we have to do is take care of our own security. That sounds easy. Everybody should take care of his or her own security, but Europeans have closed their eyes for too long. During the phase after what we call the Cold War, we have really neglected our defense systems, and we pay for that now because we are not even capable of giving to Ukraine what Ukraine would need in that very difficult situation. There will be an eroding popular support because this is costly and it is help to self-defense. So this is helping against an aggressor. But that doesn't matter. There will be a lot of people who will say, well, it's too expensive. It's something that we don't want to carry on, and why don't we have peace and work more on the peace side? I all agree with the peace side. We should do more there. I admire little Switzerland because with the Bürgerstock initiative, at least they did something, even if the Russians didn't participate. But after the Bürgerstock conference, the Russians signaled that they wanted to participate in the second conference. So this is an interesting point. The European Union is delivering all kinds of support, also military support to the Ukraine. How long will it go on? How long will it last? What form will it take? And will America help or not? On that specific issue, I cannot give you an answer because we simply don't know. All kinds of noises around the president from what we hear until now. One of the noises comes from his vice president, J.D. Vance, who says every dollar or every euro spent on Ukrainian defense is not worth being spent. And there are other people around who say that, like Mike Turner, I think he's the head of the Intelligence Committee in Congress, and he says there should be a massive boost of means to to give Ukraine more support, and so force the Russians to the negotiating table. I wonder whether any of these strategies will bear fruit. From my experience, peacemaking is not a matter of pushing a button, and it's not something you can do in 24 hours. There's no instant peace unless you want capitulation. There's one person who can stop that war immediately in a second, doesn't even take 24 hours, and that's Vladimir Putin. So this is one of the issues where we don't know how we are going to advance. For the time being, European support is substantive, massive, and enduring. Although we have a couple of members on board among the 27 who do not, in the long run, seem to share our conviction. For the time being, we are managing. With the Hungarians, it will be interesting to see and to watch what happens today, how the language is that comes out of Budapest today, because there's the meeting of the European Political Community tonight, and tomorrow will be the informal European Council, also worth watching to smell a little bit what it sounds like. Now, this is the very basics. I will not go into the details because that would really take too much space, but you can see, we've been seeing for a long time, we Europeans, that the Americans think that their role as a chief police officer of the world community is changing. I don't say that they think it's over, because they probably don't. But at least it takes different style and different shape. So there will be more responsibility on European shoulders. That's not Trump's idea, but this has been coming along for a long time. Whatever Americans think is the neighborhood, first of all, they think, and I think they are right to think that, we should be able to settle our own strictly European affairs on this continent. There's still a number of countries who are not members of the European Union. Between Greece and Italy, there are the countries of the Balkans, the Balkan states. We've been negotiating with them, we've been promising to them, we've been over-promising and under-delivering. They have been under-delivering on their obligations, if you want. But this has to be dealt with. We cannot possibly start, we will start negotiations with Ukraine. That is a political act, but that is also going to confront us with huge challenges. We want to live up to these challenges. What did you do, Arancha?
Not me. Okay, so back to the enlargement of the EU.
Yeah, Americans will expect us and Trump more than others maybe to take care of our own neighborhood. That applies to the eastern neighborhood. That applies also, and I do not only talk about Ukraine, but also about Moldova and Georgia. But it also applies to the southern neighborhood. The southern neighborhood for Americans is really Middle East, parts of the Middle East, large parts of the Middle East, the southern rim of the Mediterranean, going all the way to the Sahel. I mean, there is a major security loophole, from what I understand, in the Sahel, and we have been, both the European Union and the United Nations, not extremely successful, not to talk about bilateral relations, to stabilize the region. And to at least stabilize it in the sense of not letting it become a place where bad things would gather up on the terrorist side, because there is still that component that we don't think about unless we have a massive attack somewhere in one of our countries. So defense, self-defense, caring for the neighborhood, getting involved. I don't even talk about multilateral institutions, because you all know about that. The European Union is the largest contributor of support for the Global South in the United Nations. That is not, we are not going to have a lot of support maybe from the Americans. We have seen that they withdrew Trump withdrew on day 1 or 2 from the Paris Climate Accord. So whatever goes into the direction of climate preservation, of environmental protection, of caring for the future of the planet, the Europeans are going to be up front, and they are going to be a little bit or more alone than they have been over the last years.
Okay, thank you, Ursula. So basically, Trump is not the problem. Kamala Harris would not have been the solution. The problems of Europe have to be sorted out by Europe. Thank you for that. Let me now move to Donald. Let's look at Africa. What does a Trump administration look like from Africa?
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's the second time I've been to this school, which has produced many young Africans of first-class pedigree. I have just 4 points to make, and I'll be quite brief. The American system is what it is. It is their system. It produces different types of leaders for different periods. In the terms of your great-grandfathers, there was a president called Woodrow Wilson in the 1920s who played a big role in the creation of the League of Nations. But he never succeeded to get the Senate to ratify it. So Woodrow Wilson, who was a believer in the global approach, could not convince his Senate, and did not follow the absence of the League of Nations effectiveness. It was the World War II. And then you can come down to the president elected this week. So American system is what it is. It produces leaders. That is their democracy. And it is their right to choose whoever they want to choose. Number 2, remember that in the lifetime of your parents, there were two powers in the world which really mattered. That was America and the Soviet Union. And they fought it out not between themselves, because they were nuclear powers. They usually contested each other outside their own territories, especially in my continent in Africa. So they didn't fight directly, but they fought through proxies on my continent. Now, at some point later, there was only one power left, the US, after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Now, people tell me that we are now in a system where you have got multiple powers. They call it multipolarity. They say we used to be in unipolar, now we're in multipolar. I have some doubts on this. I'm more in the belief that we're on the high seas with what some people call fragmentation. Different bits of the world controlling different bits. China here, Europe here, US here, other middle powers, and so on. That's where we are. So it is important to interpret this development from that viewpoint. What does it matter in a world where there's not one power or two powers, but multiple conflicts, multiple interests? Number three, as far as Africa is concerned, actually, Arancha, I don't know if this will be able to explain this. For Africa, really, it does not matter who is president of the US, because there is a large degree of continuity on what matters. There will be small difference here and there, but there's a large degree of continuity, i.e., Africa is relevant only from the viewpoint of global competition. First of all, it is between the US and the Soviet Union. All right? Many of you are too young to know, for example, Africa's first failed state, which is Somalia, was an indirect result of the contest between Russia, the Soviet Union, and the US. I have no time to develop this. So it doesn't matter who is in office. That has always been the approach, i.e., Africa matters from the viewpoint of global contest. Sometimes it has been about oil economics. Because apart from the Middle East, I think some countries in the south of the US, Africa was a big source of oil for the US. No longer. Because now the US is actually self-sufficient in oil, could even be a net exporter. And there have been times when a particular president has been extremely engaged on African matters. This was the case of George Bush the second. He was very active on matters of health. He set up the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, the PEPFAR program, very active on debt cancellation. It was under his administration when the international financial institutions were allowed to cancel debt. So that was a particular initiative at a particular time. But beyond that, there's a large degree of continuity between different administrations. So I think this will not be different. There might be different degrees of emphasis, but I think it will be a continuity. Now, at the moment, there are some points of friction between US and Europe, by the way, because Russia is back in some areas. Sometimes people think China is too influential in Africa. And also there is issues around radicalism. But these are issues which are not US specific. They are Western specific as they read African issues. The third point I would like to mention is about the global economy. And I want to say this. After the end of World War II, there was only one country which came out of the war with large economic surpluses. It was the United States of America. Europe was bankrupt, right? Ruined. Japan was bankrupt, ruined. Many other parts of the world ruined. Only the US had the surpluses. So it emerged as an economic behemoth. The dollar emerged as the dominant currency. And so institutions were then shaped to reflect that particular situation. So whether it is the United Nations, the World Bank for reconstruction of Europe and Japan mainly, International Monetary Fund to avoid issues of competitive devaluations, to look into financial stability, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, later WTO, where Arancha worked for a long time, to look into issues of protectionism and trade. But these institutions were shaped basically in the US image. In the US image. Europeans like to say they were involved in shaping them. I don't think so. Yeah, it was the US which shaped these institutions. I say this because over time, as Europe recovered, as Japan recovered, and as the US surpluses began to shrink, in 1971, the American administration led by Richard Nixon, you can research that, woke up and decided to end the convertibility of the dollar, all right, in the era of the fixed exchange rates. I'm sure people studied this year. That was one of the most important economic decisions taken in the last 70 years, because it created so much chaos in the global financial markets. And coming alongside the increase in the oil prices from almost $3 per barrel to $30 per barrel in a short period of time. So even the American hegemonic control of the global economic situation could no longer hold. So the institutions which the US had helped create were no longer able to deal with it. So something called G8 was created. No, G7 first. Here in France, by President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. He brought other countries together. Look, what do we do about energy, about financial markets? So the American hegemonic power over the economic system began to see its limits then, so it needed a lot of European countries and Japan to help stabilize things, G7. Now, you move on later. Arancha and I were still in business at the time. You then have the global financial crisis. At that point, even the G7 or G7 plus 1 or G8 was no longer enough. So US, Europe, and Japan had to look for other powers in the world to create something called the G20. All right? So we have come from these institutions created in the image of the US under different presidents to a rapidly expanding cycle depending upon the crisis of the day. So where we are today, I think the thing to worry about is, given the challenges we face today in the world, my colleague just mentioned them, it's global public goods, whether it is climate, migration, security, technology, and so on. Will we have leadership in the US which understands that there are some things you can resolve alone, but there are some things you have to resolve with others? That's what matters. It doesn't matter who is in the White House. Is unilateralism possible in the world of today? Or we have to find leaders who understand that we have to work together, whether it's climate, conflicts, whatever it is. That is, I think, what we need to worry about. And we shall see that, whether the new administration agrees to increase the funding for the World Bank, for the United Nations, respects the WTO, empowers these institutions, which we rely upon for the global public goods, as they call them, the global commons. And here, I want to add that perhaps what could be a concern for me and many others is that in order to address these problems, we need to reform those institutions which have been managing the world, so to speak, the World Bank, IMF, WTO, United Nations, so that they have greater legitimacy and greater effectiveness. I think that probably what could be a problem will, if the new administration in the US feels, no, we can act on our own. We can act on our own. We don't have to reform these institutions. And yet for many of us, as I'm sure many of you, you agree that reforming these institutions is a sine qua non for us to address the challenges we face today. Now here, Arancha, as you heard me say in Brussels yesterday, I don't think it's a problem only for the US. Even Europe sometimes is an obstacle to the reform of these institutions. Reform of the World Bank, quota reform, IMF quota reform, demands action from the US, but also action from Europe. Action from Europe. Sometimes European countries are also quite behind the curve. They like to keep the powers they have enjoyed since 1945. But if you say, can you increase the voice for the emerging markets, for China, for Africa? Europeans are not necessarily any different from the US. They actually behave the same. Can we issue more special drawing rights to increase liquidity after a crisis like COVID? I'm not sure the US behaves different from the European countries. So I think we would be making a mistake to try and feel, this is why I think I agree with Arancha, the new president cannot be the problem, and the one not elected was not the solution. I agree with that. I think we are still in that space where we need all parts of the world to come in together to deal with these global commons which are threatening all of us. And I end by saying this, that as far as I'm concerned, the biggest problem I see is that as we enter the uncharted world of digital transition, energy transition, the climate issues, geopolitical configuration, it is not enough to just point on one country. It doesn't matter how powerful they are. It doesn't matter how powerful they are. So we need to look at leadership in the US, in Europe, all right, in Asia, in what we call the Global South, so that we have leadership which actually understand that we are entering a different type of the world. There's too much focus on one country, an individual. That is okay. It fills the 24-hour news cycle. But I think it overshadows the bigger issue, which is what kind of leadership we need, what kind of institutions we need for today's problems. Those are my little contributions.
Okay, thank you. So seen from the African perspective, it doesn't make much of a difference. You already have a problem and you think you're going to continue to have it. Let me now go to Asia, and let me see if Han-koo is now connected, if he's with us. Han-koo, welcome to this session. It's early for you in Washington. You are live from the Lion's Den. Han-koo, I thought it would be useful for us to hear you on trade, since trade has figured prominently in the campaign, and also to look at Asia. What does a Trump 2 presidency look like seen from Asia? Over to you.
Okay, great. Good evening. Can you hear me well?
Very well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Arancha, for inviting me to this very interesting and important, discussion. I served as Korea's trade minister up to 2022, but now I'm based in Washington, D.C. So now I'm kind of a sort of an astute observer of these American policies and then also this U.S. election. So from that point of view, I'd like to share my thought. I think, many people might have, different thought on the outcome of this U.S. election, but actually, I was really struck by the outcome of the election. Obviously, former President Trump won the second term, but he won big. So it was really kind of striking to see that he really expanded his support across the board. Geographically, also, demographically. So I think now we can say that this Trump too had a clear mandate, from broader, the scope of American people. I think it's, he studied 8-9 years ago as a sort of anti-establishment and sort of minority sort of politician. But now I think this sort of MAGA principle and his policy agenda seems to be really kind of mainstream at the moment, because he won not just this electoral college, but also this popular vote, which is the first time to any Republican candidate, the first time in since 2004, the last this President George W. Bush. So in that sense, I think Trump came back much stronger and much more emboldened with his kind of policy agenda. And also in the second term, I think in the first term, I think people tended to, or allies and partners tended to think that it is sort of a mistake. And obviously there were many trials and error in the process of kind of implementing his kind of policy agenda. But now I think this time is different. This time, I think this, the Trump, the second administration, they know exactly what they want to achieve, and they know exactly how they can achieve, and they put in place, kind of a sort of a loyalist people who can really, drive this Trump agenda. So I think this overall kind of a political landscape, we need to understand to understand how this trade policy will play out and how that will impact not just the U.S., but also around the world. So let me now zoom into this kind of trade policy angle. I think, we need to also have some kind of a big picture view or the sort of centerpieces of this Trump trade agenda. I think the most important principle is America first. And, this America first, principle, which again, much kind of a stronger, this second time around, I think that will drive, all these kind of, nuts and bolts, this trade policy measures. And then, we know that, this Trump, his policy agendas put the trade deficit at the, as one of the key sort of parameter to determine this trade and foreign, policy, foreign relations with individual country. So trade deficit, and also as we saw during this election, now the swing state, so-called this Midwest, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and then, this Michigan, I think the swing state kind of drive the U.S. trade policy, not just, kind of reflecting those sort of, the common or sort of more broader set of this U.S. policy constituency. Now, I think the U.S. trade policy tend to be driven by, this kind of addressing this concern of the stakeholders in this Midwestern, the swing state. So in that sense, kind of reviving manufacturing sector would be also another very, very important agenda of kind of trade, the Trump policy. And also I think almost all of this economic policy agenda underlying this concern is this China factor. Now I think the United States is really kind of feel threatened by the rise of China in terms of the technology, high-tech technologies, and this huge kind of supply chain manufacturing capacity. And these days, we are experiencing in many part of the world, this sort of, the fallout of these imbalances in China's macroeconomy, imbalances between domestic sector and this export sector, but also this the savings and investment, etc. So I think these are the big pictures that we need to understand, and what sort of detailed policies, measures, trade policy measures that Trump has talked about so far, promised so far, and then probably will try to implement. I think this tariff. I think trade policy will be at the center of this the Trump policy. You remember in the first Trump term, to cope with this really kind of a surging migrants from Mexico, Trump sort of announced that the U.S. will impose 5% across the board, tariff on Mexico because of this immigration problem. And then the Mexico really, got shocked, and then they negotiated. So before this 5%, this across the board tax was, came into force. I mean, they resolved, through kind of negotiation. So I think this is kind of one kind of case that we can sort of look to how this new kind of Trump 2 administration will kind of how they will try to implement the promises on tariff. So tariff is, some of the measures that Trump mentioned so far is 10 to 20%, across the board to the general tariff, and then 6% tariff against China, and then also possible revocation of PNTR, so-called permanent normal trade relations, and also so-called kind of a reciprocal kind of trade act. I think many people sort of wonder to what extent he will implement, and to what extent this is sort of a negotiating or leverage tactic. I think we don't know yet, but what is clear is that probably within first 100 days of the second Trump administration, they will really try to kind of push through, some of this. And then also probably there will be room for negotiation. They sort of announce the possible imposition of all these tariff, and then sort of open to kind of negotiation, so that some of these countries just come for with some sort of concession to find a kind of peaceful resolution. But obviously, I think that the European Union, which is really kind of a big common market and has a bargaining power, I think EU may kind of retaliate against this U.S. tariff measure. And also, second, tax cut. Tax cut is another. Tax cut and deregulation would be very important, pillar of this Trump economic policy. Especially, this tax cut. The first Trump administration, they implemented this massive tax cut in 2017, and that will expire next year. So I think throughout the whole 2025, I think there will be big. I think this tax cut will be kind of a really big, policy debate in Washington. And then another kind of a really worrying, this policy measure that the Trump is trying to put forward is a currency. So far in this conventional kind of trade, era, this sort of kind of a currency-related provisions in trade agreement weren't really a feature before, but in the first Trump administration, for the first time in the USMCA, the currency chapter was incorporated with some sort of binding obligation. And so I think there's seems to be discussion inside this Trump camp, the on the pros and cons of kind of the using this kind of a currency. They try to kind of depreciate the dollar, which could help kind of, the trade deficit that the U.S. is really accumulating the big. So what would be the impact of all these kind of different policy measures put forward by this Trump the campaign? I think obviously inflation. I think all these the economists, including my colleagues at the Peterson Institute, this inflation pressure will be really big. I mean, if the Trump really push through all these measures as promised. So we have to see how this in face of this the pressure of inflation, how much of these policies will be materialized. We know that one of the big factors for the big this Trump win this time is because of widespread inflation in the U.S. economy, and the voters cannot really kind of take it anymore. And also, I think obviously fiscal deficit and this trade deficit may continue with all these tariff measures. So what are the effects globally? I think this is really worrisome because with all these sort of protectionist measures, especially really kind of aggressive use of this punitive, these tariff measures against China as well as allies and partners, I think that could really destabilize the trading system. This Trump made it clear they prefer this bilateral approach vis-a-vis this multilateral or plurilateral, so that it's easier to kind of impose unilaterally the America First agenda. And so this multilateral trading system, WTO reform, especially will maybe kind of faltering during this presidency. And another thing is kind of supply chain. Supply chain now, I think in the Biden administration, so-called kind of economic security measures, such as export control on semiconductor, AI, etc., and also kind of investment screening. For example, when the Nippon Steel tried to invest in the U.S., the President Biden as well as Harris, they sort of opposed to this Japanese company taking over this U.S. company based on this national security. I mean, Japan is an ally, but I mean, this is sort of a disguised kind of protectionism in the name of national security. But I think these kind of national security or economic security driven policies will continue, and that could really sort of propel this bifurcation of the supply chain, global supply chain, in especially high-tech sector. For example, I think about a month ago, the U.S. Department of Commerce, they announced a new rulemaking kind of measure to ban the software and hardware connected to electric vehicle, being imported from China. So I think this is kind of this kind of measures that kind of trying to remove these China components in the supply chain. That sort of policy measures, policy move may kind of continue or even strengthen in the Trump administration. So that impact of such bifurcation of the supply chain would really, make this global business to be prepared to, for example, when they try to export to the U.S. market, they may have to use only kind of a non-Chinese, parts and materials. As we can see, EV battery and critical mineral, these sectors. But, when they export to other markets than, the U.S., I think they may be able to use kind of Chinese parts and material. So in this way, I'm afraid that in this kind of high-tech sector, this decoupling, partial decoupling, or de-risking, whatever you call it, this kind of a bifurcation of global supply chain may sort of continue. So I guess I will stop here, and then I can come back for more interactive, Q&A on any topic, including Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we are to expect heavy impact through the trade measures that have at least been announced during the campaign in the form of inflation, deficit, and continued bifurcation of the supply chains, especially on technology. Let me now focus on, João, on security and defense in Europe. Ursula started this conversation. Europe needs to take care more of its security. What's the impact of Donald Trump's presidency on the security of Europe, and in particular, the NATO alliance?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Arancha. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here at Sciences Po for the first time. I hope not the last time. Looking forward to coming back. Let me start with a little anecdote from Hemingway. In his first book, The Sun Also Rises, Hemingway talks about, has a character who used to be rich. And then this character became poor. And in the book, somebody asks, how did this happen? How did you become poor? And he said, well, I became poor two ways. First, slowly, and then very fast. And this is the situation that we are in now when we look at the changes that are happening in the world around us. If you look at the beginning, from the beginning of this century, we started with the Twin Towers attack, 9/11. We had, after that, the invasion of Afghanistan, then the cataclysmic invasion of Iraq by the United States. Then you had, in 2008, the financial crisis, at the same time as Russia went into parts of Georgia. You had, in 2014, the Russian annexation of Crimea. You had, of course, in 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And all the time we are having record levels of heat in the planet. And the situation now is, when we look at the accumulation of events, completely different from 20 years ago. The three préalables, the three assumptions that I will start with, and I won't explain them, but are, firstly, that we are witnessing a major acceleration of history, which will result in a paradigmatic change of the way the world is, and that Trump is a detonator of this. He's not the cause, but he is going to be a major factor in propelling this acceleration. Secondly, Trump 2.0 is going to be much more damaging to Europe than Trump 1.0, which was already fairly damaging, because Trump is much less restrained. There are constraints around him at the time will not exist now. And also the world is much more, in the precarity of the world means that it is much easier or will be more impactful for him to transform the situation and to make a difference to Europe. And the third préalable is that we in Europe, and I think that a lot of people are being coy about this, but we in Europe have to recognize that we no longer have an ally in the White House. On the contrary, we have in the White House somebody who sees Europe as a rival and who will be focused on dividing Europe and weakening Europe. So that is the starting point. I will take it as a given, I will skip several steps, but I will take it as a given that in Europe we need to build our defense. This is actually already a consensus. It's been a consensus probably for 10 years, 7, 8 years at least, solidly. Some countries a little bit more reluctantly came in a little bit later. Today it's an absolute consensus. The question is, if it's a consensus, why isn't it happening, or why is it happening so slowly? And the points that I want to make are about how I think that we should be working in order to have a Europe that is capable of assuming its geopolitical role, which means being a defense actor. Firstly, we need to move much more in a much faster manner in integration of command and control structures, and creation of command and control structures in Europe. And what that means is we need to have a very powerful level dialogue between France and Germany, neither of whom is in great leadership state at the moment. Between France and Germany, various other countries joining in, but those two are really fundamental. So getting the French and German houses in order is an absolute imperative for us. And I think that that's my compatriot Antonio Costa, as president of the European Council incoming, will have a tremendous job to do in that regard. Second point, we have to aggregate our demand, our procurement for defense equipment. At this moment, European Union member states acquire something like 78% of their defense equipment from outside the European Union. 2/3 of that from the US. So there's no way that you can build a defense industrial base if you do not have demand from your own countries. So aggregating, and the reason that the fragmentation of the market at the moment means that we need to find mechanisms for aggregating, for countries to aggregate their demand, and for the European companies to be able to have some kind of predictability. The model for financing our defense in the European Union at the moment is completely is not up to the task. When we had the pandemic, we managed to overcome all the rules and invent new rules with next generation European Union funding. What is that? That was going to the market, borrowing. Borrowing was a swear word, according to some finance ministers, but with the dramatic situation that Europe was facing, it was possible to establish clear parameters and say, okay, we're going to go to the market, we're going to, in effect, have common debt, and we're going to overcome the situation. And nobody has looked back. Everybody is very happy about the way this has gone. The situation that we are in with defense, in my view, requires common debt. Again, this is something that some countries, and particularly some finance ministers, are completely against. But the evolution yesterday of the situation in the German government may actually help us to move towards a situation where this is recognized and we are able to create an appropriate financing model. The next thing that we need to do is rethink what our strategy is. We have something called a strategic compass in Europe. It's from 2022, and this was a kind of roadmap about where we want to go and how we want to go in terms of European security and defense. It's outdated already because everything that has happened since 2022 means the world has changed very rapidly, and we need to change our approach. We need to have a massively more ambitious strategic compass. We need to start with something that we did back in 2020 for the first time ever. It was already a major advance back then, which is something called the joint threat assessment. If you want to know what kind of ambitions to establish for your defense, you need to know what the threats are. But we didn't have that in Europe. And so we did a joint threat assessment, very complex exercise, and we managed to work out what all of us at 27 countries thought were our common threats. That was the basis. Common threats have changed. They change very quickly, so we need to do that again. And I would say the next semester, the first few months of 2025, need to be ones in which we are making our joint threat assessment and we are establishing our new strategic compass. Is that going to be enough? I used to have a professor at university who was a wonderful lady called Susan Strange, a professor at the London School of Economics. And Susan Strange, whenever we used the word, the expression, political will, she would say, no. I don't want to hear about political will. Of course, it's true that things can happen if there's political will. But when you use the political will, when you use that as if it's an explanation, what you have to do is explain what are the factors, what are the interests and motivations that create this political will. That's what we need to be looking at. And so, yes, it's true, we need to have the political will. But what are the factors, what are the interests behind that can create this political will? Internal stability is one, external instability is another. For many of us in Europe, the election of Donald Trump a couple of days ago was a bucket of cold water. But buckets of cold water at least have the benefit of waking you up. So let's see if this bucket of cold water allows us to go back to a comfortable state of relaxation or not. My view is that it is actually fundamental for Europe to be able to respond to this. If we don't do this, then we will be in a situation in a few years' time that Ursula Plassnik described about looking back at our ambitions from the early 2000s and saying, well, there were great ambitions, but we failed completely. Worse, those ambitions from 2024 or 25, if they are not fulfilled, it won't be 20 years' time that we're looking back at our failures. It will be just in a few years' time. And the transformation in Europe, in the world rather, will mean that Europe will have become increasingly irrelevant in a geopolitical world order that escapes us. Our task immediately, while we think about the philosophies and the mechanisms and the instruments and the ambitions, our task has to be to support Ukraine, because if we get distracted from that objective, then we will be in a situation whereby Putin will be aiming. I don't know about pieces of territory, I'm not sure that's the logic, but he will certainly be aiming at destroying the European project. This is something that I think public opinions in Europe have not properly understood, because when we look at Eurobarometers, we see quite a lot of support for Ukraine. But then when other questions are asked, we see that the support for Ukraine is very often based on solidarity, based on the idea that international law is a good thing and should be kept, and clearly Putin was infringing international law. Actually, we should be supporting Ukraine because we have a very big interest. And the Eurobarometer questions that ask about whether what is happening in Ukraine or whether the outcome of the Ukraine war will affect you as a European citizen, many, many European citizens are saying, well, not really. We should support Ukraine, but it won't really affect me one way or another. That is a major mistake. And I hope that that will be a stimulus for the European leaders over the next few weeks, few months. Jean-Claude Juncker had an expression which I think is very true. He would say, all of us European leaders, we know what we have to do. The only problem is we don't know how to get re-elected afterwards. Now, we need to be able to overcome that barrier. We need to be able to communicate. We need our leaders to be able to communicate with our publics in a way that will help them to get re-elected afterwards, because otherwise, as political leaders, they won't want to do it. And we need our publics to be able to understand what is at stake. And what is at stake at the moment for Europe, in a manner that is very much underlined and accelerated by the future Trump administration, is our relevance as a geopolitical actor. And that means also our capacity to shape our own futures as Europeans. So I'll stick to that.
Thank you, João. We are having trouble connecting with Maria Fernanda Espinosa. We've been trying, but it's not working. So I suggest that we open the floor to your questions. Two mics, one on each side. Up to you now to shoot, as they say. All right, let me go. So let's just start with the other one in the meantime. No? Yeah? Good. Okay.
Thank you so much for the conference and for your interesting interventions. My name is Sebastian. I'm a student here in Sciences Po in the certificate for refugee students. I would like to talk about the question I would like to ask is in the defense sector. So you talked about that it's very important for Europe to build its own defense strategy. But what I am a bit afraid of is that Trump, you know, what in America, what they analyze, what they say, how did Trump break the glass ceiling? How did he get like 5-6 million more voters? He used identity politics to win his presidency. So he appealed to masculinity, he appealed to men protecting women, even if they didn't want to. And what I see is that that's kind of like being contagious here in Europe. And I see in, for example, in France, the coming to power of the far right. And if Marine Le Pen is not found guilty in the following weeks, she will eventually and probably win the presidency. And how is Europe going to build a common defense strategy if you have politicians that are Euroscepticists and if you have politicians that, as Marine Le Pen said, want to go out of NATO? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take a few questions and then throw them to the panelists, okay? Let's start over there.
Hello. Thank you for the talk and the discussion. That was really interesting. I wanted to go back to this issue of the bifurcation in global trade and the distinction between decoupling and de-risking. And I guess my question is, ultimately, is there a difference? Is de-risking just a word sort of invented, I think, by von der Leyen to cover up what is essentially the same thing? Or do you think there's a real policy difference there? Thank you.
Okay. Gentleman over there.
Hello, I have two, excuse me, I have two questions. My name is Omar. Thank you for your presentation. My first question is for Mr. Yeo. I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. You mentioned something really interesting to me. You mentioned that swing states have driven U.S. trade policy. And I was wondering if your institute and your research has gathered any specifics on how the swing states may have influenced U.S. trade policy for this election specifically. My next question was for...
Just one, so that your colleagues get that. Yeah? Thanks. If there is chance, then we give you a second round. Yes?
Hello, my name is Rodrigo. The more I study foreign policy, the more I feel like it's quite impossible for small countries to leverage their importance in the international arena. And I mean, obviously, bilateral relations are important, but putting it simply, I feel like small countries don't matter for significant decision-making. And being from a small country myself, Portugal. Can you prove me wrong?
There is plenty of small countries in this panel. All right, let's just start with this one. Ursula. Ursula, you take that one.
You know, it's like with people. There are tall people, there are smaller people. Some of them are funny, some of them are smart, some of them know how to make good cookies, and others how to grow violets. So I think the important thing is really, and I share much of the frustration you have expressed, because sometimes you really think, who's going to hear me, who listens to me? And it's important in democracies. Why? Because you have to explain to your people what you're here for. I had to explain to my Austrian compatriots what the red, white, red, rot-weiß-rote Handschrift, the red, white, red print, fingerprint on European policy was. You know, where did I make a difference? Now, the easiest way for small countries to make a difference is to be nasty. It's like real life, but it's not something that is sustainable. Who really wants to be the odd woman out or the odd man out in the corner? So sooner or later you realize that you can only be nasty in the extreme situation where you're running for your life and defending your most vital interests. The more interesting thing is to find a governance system, and that for me is the big advantage in the European Union, where these different types of people, countries, small and big, can balance their interests. And this is what I meant with the challenge from Trump to the European DNA and to the European business model in a way, because it's not about deal-making only. It's about values, it's about the way of life, the way we want to balance our interests, the way we want the smaller ones and the bigger ones to cooperate, to coordinate, to coexist, and to take decisions in a form of shared pooled sovereignty, shared sovereignty exercise. This is what's so dramatically new about the European business model. And it is something that will remain. It will remain as an example for others. And I am very proud of that. I'm a very proud European, as you will understand, because if I look at the American system now, and I went to America on my first scholarship at the age of 15, so I learned the American system. The American system seems to be capable of outsmarting itself, because the sheer power that Donald Trump will have in the case, I'm just speculating that both houses of parliament are on his side. He already has a Supreme Court very much to his liking, with all due respect for the independence of the judiciary also in the United States. So, this extreme power, the popular vote, I mean, how is this going to be possible? Where is the checks and balances that I've learned about and that we also like in the European systems? So that's what I really find interesting. And there is something that is something that can never happen in the European Union. It just cannot happen, because the system we have worked out with all the, taking care, involving, engaging minorities, small countries, giving them weight, disproportionate weight in decision-taking, that is unique. And this is what in a way is challenged, because of course it works more slowly by its very nature. The more people you integrate or include into your decision shaping and taking, the longer it takes, because you have to talk to people, you have to listen to their interests. So the European Union, the big advantage for the smaller ones is that they get a place at the table, that they are able to participate. And if they are smart, they contribute in constructive issues. They bring in their best practices. They bring in their best proposals for solutions that serve the common purpose. Sorry for being a bit lengthy, but I think it's an important point.
So, Donald, you also come from a small country.
Well,
do small countries matter, basically, for foreign policy?
You see, my country is 27,000 square kilometers. So even the Netherlands is several times bigger than where I come from. But we are 14 million people. 14 million people. So you could talk about small as a geographical concept, or small as a demographic concept. And you need to be careful. Some of the most influential countries today in the world are quite small, either demographically or even geographically. Take Singapore. Is Singapore an influential country in Asia? It is? You agree? Okay. I could go on, pick another examples. So for me, that's not the issue. The issue which is a concern to me and to you is that a few countries have confiscated global power, leaving out huge demographies outside the global power structure. That is not sustainable. So today, if you look at the United Nations Security Council, there's not a single African country, not a single one, not a single Islamic country, not a single one. Not a single Latin American country, not a single one. Not India, which is now the world's most populous country. No Indonesia, which would be a superpower very soon. That is what should worry you, i.e., a small group of countries who got out of the World War II in a more advantageous position have confiscated global economic and political structures. That is where the problem is. That cannot be sustained. So just in a few years, 2050, I tell you, Arancha, I will need your support here. When European countries were colonizing my continent, Europe had a bigger population than Africa, almost double in size. Just go and research. We were on, because life expectancy was only 28 years. Infant mortality was very high and so on. By 1950, European population and African population were at par. Now today, European population vis-à-vis African population is infinitesimally different. All right? Very different. So rather than counting small countries, big countries, now because of globalization and mobility, all right, we need to rethink differently what Arancha calls the global bargain. Okay. Not simply big powers, small powers. It's about what do we do together. Now, but for the person who asked about the size of the countries, a friend of mine likes to say that small countries are like speedboats. Speedboats. And big countries are like tankers. Now, a speedboat is very flexible. It moves fast. It can move, change direction, escape. A tanker, if you're trying to change its direction, it will take a long, long time. All right? So look at SARS in terms of flexibility, whether it is technology, whether dealing with pandemics, whether dealing with particular threats, and the big countries, the issues they face. So I look at COVID, and I'll end there. COVID. Who are the countries who did very well during COVID? South Korea, an exemplar. Vietnam, extremely well. My own country, extremely well. We are small. But look at some of the big wealthy countries. By the way, I gather even the US did not do particularly well, at least in some areas. Look at northern Italy. So the challenges we face today are not simply met by size, whether it is geographical or the size of your military. It's about flexibility, innovation, adaptation, and so on. These are things which matter in the world in which you live in.
So, João, defense, how does one advance on defense at the time of nationalism? I guess that was the question.
Yeah, Sebastian, thank you very much. A good question. Let me just add one point to the previous, I think, answers, very complete answers given by my colleagues, to say that niche diplomacy is also a way for small countries to multiply their relevance. And the second point, Ursula Plassnik rightly points out that there's disproportionate power given to small countries, but it's also a good deal for the big countries, because where would France and Germany be without the European Union? They would not be particularly relevant in today's world. On Sebastian's question, it goes to the heart of where we are at the moment and the threats that we face. The possibility of further influence of the extreme right coming across the Atlantic. Project 2025, which if you haven't heard about it or know about it, you're going to hear a lot about it in the next few months as Donald Trump implements his plans. This is something that has a lot of elements that are attractive to the extreme right in Europe. The identity politics that is very, very prevalent in some countries and is very much feeding extreme right movements here. These factors are profoundly detrimental to the European project. In fact, they aim to undermine the European project. And the possibility of developing a European defense with governments representing these tendencies around the table is extremely limited. So what we need to be able to do is, number one, we need to be able to absolutely ensure the safety of our institutions, because what these political movements are trying to do is to undermine our institutions. And all across Europe and in the US, you see this coming into play. We need to make sure that doesn't happen. We need also something else, which is we need to go beyond the rule of unanimity. Because with 27 member states, there will always be one or two or three spoilers. There will always be one or two or three who either for ideological reasons or for reasons of convenience or because they want to hold some policy hostage because of another interest, they block everything. And I've been doing a little bit of reading and thinking about this. We do have the means to advance without the unanimity rules that at the moment are so complicated for us. Namely, if anybody wants to look up Article 20 of the Treaty of the European Union and the corresponding articles in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, I think there are ways whereby we can have not 27, but 20-something member states cooperating as if they were the whole group without being hampered by the unanimity rules. However, Sebastian, the only answer that I have for you with respect to the question of what about if we have Eurosceptic governments in charge, we will not have a European defense. We will not have a Europe that is capable of standing up for itself. It won't be only in the field of defense, it will be in many other fields that Europe will be undermined. And I think people need to be very lucid and clear-minded about what is at stake when they are looking at somebody with a cute TikTok message that is actually aimed at really undermining pillars fundamental for the future of us in Europe. But I'm an optimist. I believe that this is not likely, unlike you, but I hope that in 2027 you will be proved wrong. I believe that there is plenty of space for us in Europe, not least because reality of the world around us will impose itself for us to be moving forward together as Europe.
Thank you. Let me go to Han-koo briefly on two issues. Is there a difference between decoupling and de-risking? And what about the trade policy driven in the US by the swing states?
Yes, I think this is really a great question. The first, de-risking versus decoupling. I don't see this is really there's any kind of precise theoretic definition between these two. But in practice, the way I think practitioners see the difference between these two is that, decoupled is like really severing, this relationship, of your partners in the supply chain. But I think de-risking is you continue to, trade and develop these economic relations with your partner. But now I think we realize that over-dependence is kind of risky, not just in terms of economic viability, but also this sort of potential national security angle. So in that sense, de-risking is a bit more kind of nuanced term, kind of trying to, striking a balance between sort of, the hedging against this kind of over-dependence and kind of a risk versus continuing to kind of maintain some sort of harmonious relation. And the second, swing states, I think that'll be a great the research project. But I as far as I know, I haven't met any sort of quantitative analysis yet on this. But I think there are many anecdotal cases, as I mentioned. This Nippon Steel case or this Section 232 steel tariff on steel, based on this national security. In the first Trump administration, they imposed 25% tariff on steel on the rationale that this has a national security implication. So yes, I mean it could protect very, very small kind of constituency of the steel industry or some, kind of manufacturing sector, but at the, sacrifice or at the expense of kind of broader consumers or sort of industry in the downstream, kind of using steel or this for their input. So in that sense, I think, right now, I'm not really sure whether this U.S. trade policy really reflect overall interest of all American, including consumers and, other downstream industry. Now it's more focused on this kind of manufacturing, trying to revive this manufacturing sector in this kind of politically very critical, the state, the swing state. Lastly, I just also want to, chime in this small country. I believe that, small countries or kind of third country, not U.S., not China. I mean, this U.S.-China competition will continue. I don't know how long it will last, but this is another sort of a new normal that you have to really kind of face. But if you look at Asia and in the trade field, there are many kind of meaningful ideas and initiative which were kind of initiated by so-called kind of small countries. For example, CPTPP, but actually CPTPP was started from this P4 initiative composed of very small 4 countries, Singapore and New Zealand, etc. And then that really kind of evolved into mega scale this CPTPP. And also these days in the digital trade space, there is a kind of DEPA, Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. Again, this was initiated by small countries like Singapore and New Zealand. And then after they, developed this pact, Korea joined. And then now the China is knocking on the door to accede into this kind of state-of-the-art digital trade pact. Another example is recently Costa Rica, New Zealand, and Iceland, and possibly kind of Norway, they also concluded this sort of a new kind of the trade plus climate change, the pact, which is a so-called agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability. And so this is also some of our, new idea we put forward from these small countries, and we can really contribute to, the growing the scale and into kind of broader plurilateral or multilateral project. So I think that small countries and, the middle power countries and the third countries are still important. And I think that especially in the second Trump administration, I strongly believe that European Union and, key Asian countries, middle power countries in Asia, they need to collaborate more. In the first Trump administration, I think, each country was, kind of the first shock they experienced. So they really kind of scrambled to deal with this, Trump administration, the first one, on their own, without really coordinating, among this like-minded country, except for the United States. But now this is the second time around, and all these countries have, experience from the first Trump administration. So in the second time, I think each country needs to still have to, cope with this new, stronger, this Trump administration. But in addition to that, I think the Europe, Asia, and, Africa, Latin America, I think we need to coordinate better. Thank you.
Thank you. On this bit of a commercial, I've just issued an article in the European Council on Foreign Relations on precisely this point of alliances beyond the big guys. And this would be very important in the coming future. We are very out of time, but I'm going to take a last question because we started a bit late. So go.
Hi, my name is Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Elise. First of all, thank you for the very interesting
So what do we do if the target is undermining or weakening the EU?
Well, mobilize. Mobilize in defending the European Union, mobilize in explaining what it is all about, and enjoying complexity. You know, one of the reasons why Donald Trump won is that he breaks down things to a very, very simple level. Now, populism for me, if this was the question, is really pretending to have simple answers, pretending that there are simple answers to complex issues. I'm afraid this is just not possible. But it's very difficult as a politician to bring it across to your voters because people have their lives, you know, they don't deal with politics all the time. So they are satisfied when they get the short, quick answer that makes sense to them. How can anybody do what Donald Trump did? And we all saw it on television. I will stop inflation. I will stop the invasion. I will solve the war in 24 hours. I mean, how can a thinking being do that? It's so provocative, but then again, this kind of provocation goes down well because people, a lot of people have the impression that it expresses their feelings. So this is this very specific issue we have with populist politicians, not only in America, not only in Europe, by the way. I have no other recipe than being serious about it, taking the issues behind their argumentation very seriously. Because inflation for a lot of people in America was much more of a subject than we might have thought. I would not have the answer that Donald Trump gave, but maybe people didn't at that stage want answers, but they wanted their feelings to be taken to the microphone, and Donald Trump is the microphone. So what can we do? We can explain, we can convince, we can have strategic patience in dealing with these issues. I think it would be really wrong, and I think it is wrong to demonize people, to demonize political movements, because it doesn't get us anywhere. It's insufficient. It's just, you know, it's just something that sounds like a record that has been turned around too many times. And it doesn't explain anything. So we have to explain the value added of cooperation, of working for what the goals that we set for ourselves. The European Union is writing the script according to which people here want to live. And we do it democratically. That's unique. That's complicated. It takes time. It's not the dictatorial way of doing things, but this is how people want to live, how we want to live.
All right, we've come to the end of this session. It's clearly not the end of this conversation. We note the interest. We will continue to unpack the consequences of the US election from different angles. Thank you very much. Give them a big applause. Thank you, Han-koo. And thank you, Han-koo, for being with us. Thank you. See you soon.